October 26, 1944, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most legendary fighter aces with over 60 confirmed kills, sits in the debriefing room, staring at a piece of paper that makes no sense. It's a reconnaissance photograph of an American P-38 Lightning, tail number clearly visible. His wingman took the photo 3 days ago during a dogfight over Bougainville. Sakai personally put a 20mm cannon round through this aircraft's engine nacelle. He watched it trail smoke and dive away, the pilot barely maintaining control. The plane was dead. He was certain of it. And yet, here it is again. Same tail number. Same unit markings. Flying combat air patrol over the same sector this morning. His intelligence officer suggests it might be a clerical error, a mix-up with the identification. Sakai shakes his head. He's been flying combat missions since 1938. He knows what a killing shot looks like. That P-38 should be at the bottom of the ocean or scattered across a jungle hillside. But it's flying. Again. This isn't the first time he's seen this. Over the past 6 months, Sakai and his fellow pilots have been documenting something that defies everything they understand about aerial warfare. American aircraft that they've shot, confirmed hit with cannon fire, seen trailing smoke and fuel, are reappearing in combat within days. Sometimes the same day. It's not possible. And yet it keeps happening. What the Japanese pilots were witnessing wasn't supernatural. It wasn't American propaganda or psychological warfare. It was something far more terrifying to a military culture built on spiritual warrior virtues. They were watching industrial logistics operate at a scale and efficiency that made battlefield damage functionally irrelevant. They were learning that America hadn't just built better planes. They'd built a system that could resurrect the dead. To understand why this phenomenon shattered Japanese confidence, you need to understand what happened when a Japanese aircraft took damage in combat. The Japanese military operated on a philosophy that had served them well in their wars against China and Russia. Frontline units were self-sufficient. Pilots were expected to be warriors, not mechanics. Aircraft were tools of war, and damaged tools were replaced by new ones from the homeland when possible. When a Zero or a Betty bomber returned from a mission with battle damage, the ground crew would assess it. Minor damage, bullet holes through non-critical areas, could be patched. But anything serious, structural damage to the airframe, engine problems, damaged control surfaces, meant the aircraft was finished. There were no spare parts. There were no repair depots. The mechanics didn't have the tools, the materials, or the training to rebuild aircraft in the field. So damaged planes were cannibalized. You'd strip the working engine from one plane to keep another flying. You'd take the instruments from a crashed aircraft to replace those destroyed in another. It was a constant process of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and with each battle, the overall strength of the unit diminished. A squadron that started with 20 aircraft might be down to 12 operational planes within a month, even if only 3 had been shot down. The rest were sitting at the end of the runway, slowly being picked apart for spare parts. Japanese pilots accepted this as the nature of war. Combat was a war of attrition. You flew your aircraft until it was destroyed or too damaged to fix, and then you hoped a replacement would arrive from Japan. Sometimes it did. More often, by 1944, it didn't. Japanese industry was being strangled by submarine warfare and strategic bombing. The supply lines were cut. The factories couldn't keep up with losses. So when Japanese pilots damaged an American aircraft in combat, they assumed the same logic applied. That plane was gone. Maybe not destroyed, but operationally finished, out of the war. One less enemy to face tomorrow. They were catastrophically wrong. The first documented case of the ghost planes phenomenon came from the Solomon Islands campaign in early 1943. A flight of Japanese Zeros encountered a formation of American F-4F Wildcats. One Wildcat, tail number clearly noted in the Japanese after-action report, took multiple hits. The Japanese pilot reported seeing holes punched through the wings, smoke from the engine, and the aircraft diving away toward Henderson Field. It was recorded as a probable kill. 2 days later, the same Wildcat was back. Same tail number, same pilot, identified by other American aircraft in the formation. The Japanese squadron leader filed a report suggesting American propaganda that they were painting multiple aircraft with the same numbers to inflate their operational strength. But the reports kept coming. From Rabaul, from Truk, from Wewak. Japanese pilots were seeing American aircraft take damage that should have ended their combat life, and then seeing those same aircraft return to battle within 48 to 72 hours. The pattern was too consistent to be propaganda. Something else was happening. What the Japanese didn't know, what they couldn't know, because it was so far outside their operational experience, was that the Americans had built an entire parallel military structure dedicated solely to keeping damaged aircraft flying. They called it the Air Service Command, and it was one of the most revolutionary logistics innovations of the war. At every major American air base in the Pacific, there were repair depots, not maintenance hangars, complete aircraft reconstruction facilities, staffed by hundreds of trained mechanics, metal workers, and engineers, equipped with machine shops, welding equipment, spare parts warehouses, and detailed technical manuals for every aircraft type in the inventory. When an American plane landed with battle damage, it didn't get cannibalized. It got triaged. A team would assess the damage, determine what needed to be fixed, and assign it a priority level. Critical damage that affected flight safety got immediate attention. Cosmetic damage could wait. And the repair work didn't just patch holes, it rebuilt the aircraft to factory specifications. The scale of this operation was staggering. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the depot could handle 30 aircraft simultaneously. At larger bases like Espiritu Santo, the number was over 100. Every day, damaged aircraft that Japanese pilots had recorded as kills would be stripped down, repaired, tested, and returned to operational status. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Pacific reported approximately 3,200 aircraft as combat damaged, requiring major repair. Of those, 2,170 were returned to operational status. That's an 89% recovery rate. Nearly 9 out of every 10 planes the Japanese thought they'd eliminated from the war came back. For the Japanese, the equivalent recovery rate was approximately 20%. 4 out of 5 damaged aircraft were permanent losses, either abandoned or stripped for parts. But it wasn't just the repair facilities. It was the philosophy behind them. American aircraft were designed from the beginning to be repairable. The P-38 Lightning had modular components. If an engine was damaged, you didn't rebuild the engine. You unbolted it and dropped in a replacement from stock. Total time, 4 hours. The entire engine nacelle could be replaced in 8 hours if needed. Japanese aircraft weren't designed this way. The Zero's engine was fitted to the airframe with custom mounts. Removing it required specialized tools and took days. And even if you got it out, there were no spare engines in the field. You either waited for one to be shipped from Japan, which might take months, or you cannibalized another damaged aircraft. The Americans had anticipated this problem years before the war started. They'd looked at the logistics of fighting across the Pacific and realized that traditional resupply methods wouldn't work. So they'd built redundancy into everything. Every aircraft carrier had a complete machine shop. Every advance base received regular shipments of spare parts, not just for one aircraft type, but for every aircraft they might encounter. At its peak, the Air Service Command maintained parts inventories that would seem insane by Japanese standards. A single depot on New Guinea had over 47,000 different spare parts in stock. Everything from replacement propeller blades to radio crystals to entire engine blocks. If a mechanic needed a part, it was available. If it wasn't in stock locally, it could be flown in from Australia or Hawaii within 48 hours. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to be unkillable. You could shoot an American plane, watch it smoke and dive away, claim it as a victory, and then face it again 3 days later. It created a sense of hopelessness that no amount of martial spirit could overcome. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe, a Zero pilot who survived the war, described it in his post-war memoir. "We called them Yurei Hikuki, ghost planes. You would damage one in combat, certain it was finished, and then see it again. Always the same markings, the same number. At first we thought we were mistaken, that our eyes had deceived us in the chaos of combat. But it happened too many times to be coincidence. Eventually we realized the truth. The Americans could repair anything. They could bring the dead back to life." The realization extended beyond just aircraft survival rates. Japanese pilots began to notice that American pilots were surviving encounters that should have killed them. A pilot would eject from a damaged plane over water, and instead of being lost, he'd be back in combat within a week, flying a new aircraft, but definitely the same pilot, recognized by his flying style or confirmed by captured documents. The Americans had created an entire rescue and recovery apparatus that the Japanese couldn't match. Every major combat zone had Catalina flying boats and submarines dedicated to pilot rescue, radio beacons in life vests, detailed search patterns. The average time for an American pilot in the water to be recovered was 4 to 6 hours. For Japanese pilots, rescue was essentially random luck. If you went down over water and weren't immediately picked up by your own forces, you were considered lost. This meant that American squadrons maintained their experienced pilot corps. A pilot could fly 50, 60, even 70 missions because when his aircraft was shot up, he was extracted, given a new plane, and sent back into combat. Japanese pilots, once lost, were gone forever. The attrition of experience was devastating. By mid-1944, the phenomenon had created a catastrophic morale problem for Japanese aviation units. Pilots were reporting kills that didn't seem to reduce enemy strength. Intelligence officers were trying to reconcile combat reports with observed American force levels and couldn't make the numbers work. If Japanese pilots had destroyed as many American aircraft as they claimed, the U.S. should have been unable to maintain air operations. But American strength wasn't diminishing. It was growing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 crystallized the horror of this realization. In what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed in a single day. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were shot down or lost operationally. It was a catastrophe. But here's what broke the Japanese high command. 3 days after the battle, American carrier air strength was back to approximately 90% of pre-battle levels. It was impossible. The Americans had lost aircraft in the battle. They'd reported losses. But somehow their operational strength had barely changed. What the Japanese didn't know was that the American carriers had extensive repair facilities on board. Aircraft with battle damage were being rebuilt at sea while the task force maneuvered. Additionally, Replacement aircraft and pilots were being flown in from rear bases on transport planes. The American fleet wasn't just a fighting force. It was a mobile aircraft factory. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, reviewing the battle reports, wrote in his personal diary, "The enemy possesses a capacity for renewal that makes traditional attrition warfare meaningless. We shoot down their planes, they build more. We damage their planes, they repair them. We kill their pilots, they rescue them and send them back. This is not a war of courage or skill. This is a war of industrial systems, and we have already lost." The contrast with Japanese operations was stark and getting worse. By late 1944, a Japanese aircraft that sustained any significant damage was effectively out of the war. There were no parts to repair it. There were no skilled mechanics who could do the work even if parts existed. The aircraft would sit at the end of the runway, slowly deteriorating, until it was either destroyed in an air raid or pushed aside to clear space. Japanese pilot training had collapsed for similar reasons. Japan was running out of fuel, so training flights were cut back. They were running out of experienced instructors who were being sent to the front to plug gaps. They were running out of training aircraft because those planes couldn't be maintained either. The average Japanese pilot in 1944 had less than 100 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. American pilots had 300 hours minimum. This meant that when a Japanese pilot encountered an American formation, he was facing pilots who were more experienced, flying aircraft that were more survivable, supported by a logistics system that could repair and recover losses at a rate that seemed magical. The mathematical impossibility of victory was obvious to anyone who could see the whole picture. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war, later explained the demoralization. "In 1942, we believed we could win through superior spirit and training. By 1943, we knew we were losing the material war, but hoped our warriors could overcome the difference. By 1944, we understood that material superiority had become so extreme that spirit was irrelevant. You cannot outfight a factory, you cannot outfly a supply chain, and you cannot maintain morale when the enemy you damaged today is attacking you again tomorrow." The final crushing blow came with the advent of American mobile repair ships. The USS Vulcan, USS Ajax, and other repair vessels were essentially floating factories that could conduct major overhauls on damaged aircraft at forward bases. These ships could replace entire aircraft wings, rebuild engines, repair structural damage that would have been considered irreparable by Japanese standards. One documented case exemplifies the gap. In August 1944, a B-24 Liberator was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire over Truk. The damage was severe. One engine destroyed, major holes in the wing, tail section partially severed, hydraulic system failure. The crew managed to limp the aircraft to Eniwetok, where it crash-landed on the beach. Japanese intelligence photographed the wreck and filed it as destroyed. 13 days later, that same B-24, identified by its nose art and tail number, was photographed over Truk again. The Japanese report noted it as impossible, possible error in identification. There was no error. The USS Ajax had been anchored at Eniwetok. Its crew had dragged the B-24 off the beach, rebuilt the tail section using spare parts, installed a replacement engine, repaired the wing, and flight tested the aircraft. Total man-hours, approximately 900. The plane that Japanese observers had been certain was destroyed had been returned to combat in less than 2 weeks. Compare this to a Japanese Betty bomber that made an emergency landing on Rabaul with similar damage in the same month. It sat on the runway for 6 weeks waiting for parts that never arrived. Eventually, The wings were removed and used to repair two other damaged Bettys. The fuselage was pushed into the jungle and abandoned. That was standard operating procedure. The Americans weren't just winning the air war through better aircraft or braver pilots. They were winning through a logistical and industrial apparatus that had weaponized the concept of repair itself. Every American aircraft was effectively multiple aircraft because it could be damaged, repaired, damaged again, and repaired again, potentially dozens of times over its service life. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, had one life. When it was damaged beyond field-expedient repairs, it was gone. This meant that every time a Japanese pilot inflicted what he thought was a killing blow on an American aircraft, there was a better than 80% chance that aircraft would return to combat. Meanwhile, every time an American pilot damaged a Japanese aircraft to the same degree, there was an 80% chance it was permanently out of the war. The mathematics of this disparity are staggering. If you start with equal forces of 100 aircraft each, and both sides inflict equal damage, after 1 month of operations, the Americans might have 85 operational aircraft while the Japanese have 30. After 2 months, Americans have 75 while Japanese have 10. The curve isn't linear, it's exponential. And it wasn't just aircraft. American radios that were damaged could be repaired or replaced from depot stocks. Japanese radios, once broken, couldn't be fixed because the vacuum tubes weren't available and couldn't be manufactured in the field. American radar sets had modular components that could be swapped out. Japanese radar sets, when damaged, were often completely scrapped. The phenomenon extended to engines. American aircraft engines were designed for battlefield repair with standardized parts. If a cylinder head cracked, you replaced that cylinder. If a supercharger failed, you unbolted it and installed a new one. Japanese engines weren't designed this way. A major failure meant the entire engine was junk, and without replacement engines available, that meant the entire aircraft was junk. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, summarized the situation in a classified report in November 1944. The enemy's capacity to restore damaged aircraft to operational status exceeds our capacity to damage them. For every aircraft we remove from combat, they return 1.5 aircraft to combat. This ratio, if maintained, guarantees our eventual defeat, regardless of pilot courage or tactical skill. His recommendation was stark. The only way to defeat American air power was to destroy the aircraft completely, not just damage them. This meant kamikaze tactics. If you couldn't win through attrition because the enemy repaired faster than you could inflict damage, the only solution was to make every attack absolutely final. The kamikaze program, launched in October 1944, was in part a response to this resurrection phenomenon. Japanese leadership had concluded that conventional aerial combat was unwinnable because they were fighting an enemy that could regenerate losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The only way to make losses stick was to ensure complete destruction, even if it meant sacrificing the pilot as well. It was the ultimate admission of defeat in the logistics war. When you resort to suicide attacks because you can't sustain conventional operations, you've already lost. The mathematics had become so unfavorable that the only remaining strategy was to trade one irreplaceable Japanese pilot for one American aircraft, hoping that the psychological impact would outweigh the material imbalance. It didn't work, because even kamikaze attacks, while more effective at permanently destroying American aircraft, couldn't overcome the production and repair gap. The United States was building new aircraft faster than kamikazes could destroy them, and repairing damaged ships faster than they could sink them. The final accounting of the Pacific Air War is a testament to the power of industrial logistics over martial valor. Japan produced approximately 70,000 aircraft during the war. The United States produced over 300,000. But the actual disparity in operational strength was even greater than that 4-to-1 ratio suggests, because American aircraft had multiple operational lives, while Japanese aircraft had one. If you account for repair and recovery rates, the effective American production was closer to 450,000 operational aircraft lifetimes. Japan's effective production was maybe 80,000, a 5.6-to-1 advantage that made conventional victory mathematically impossible. Saburo Sakai survived the war. In a 1990s interview, he was asked about the moment he knew Japan would lose. His answer was immediate. When I saw my third ghost plane. The third time I encountered an American aircraft I knew I had damaged severely, and it was still flying. That's when I understood we were not fighting pilots. We were fighting a system. And you cannot shoot down a system. The Americans hadn't just built better aircraft. They'd built better support systems, better repair facilities, better supply chains, better rescue operations, and better logistics networks. They'd industrialized every aspect of air operations, including survival. Japanese pilots were fighting with the mindset of samurai, where each loss was permanent and meaningful. American pilots were fighting with the mindset of mass production, where losses were temporary setbacks to be corrected through systematic repair and replacement. In the end, the ghost planes weren't ghosts at all. They were the physical manifestation of American industrial capacity, the proof that wars in the modern age aren't won by warriors alone. They're won by factories, supply chains, repair depots, and an economic system that can absorb staggering losses and still grow stronger. When Japanese pilots looked up at the sky and saw aircraft they'd damaged days before, they weren't seeing the supernatural. They were seeing the future of warfare. And that future had no place for warriors who expected their enemies to stay dead.